Ina mana, ina reo, ina rao rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this webinar on the Independent Electoral Review. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to talk about the interim report. Before we introduce ourselves, I'll ask our Deputy Chair, Maria, to start us off with a karakia.
Pēnā koutou katoa, kua hui mai nei, mō tēnei kōrero me karakia tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Kia hia ki ana te atākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora.
Thank you. Today in attendance are our Deputy Chair, Professor Maria Barge, Professor Andrew Geddes, Robert Pedden, Alice Mander, and I also want to acknowledge Associate Professor Lara Greaves, also on the panel, who couldn't be with us today. And I'm Deborah Hard, I'm the Chair of the Independent Electoral Review Panel. We also have members of our Secretariat with us today to take notes and support the meeting. Today's session is about sharing some of the recommendations from our interim report. We'll give a brief introduction to the review, an overview of the key changes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. A few housekeeping matters before we start. To submit a question, enter it in the chat box on the right of your screen. Our Secretariat staff will pass these on to us to respond to in the Q&A. If we receive a lot of similar questions, the Secretariat may combine these for us. Feel free, please, to submit your questions as we go. You don't have to wait for that Q&A to start. The chat box is going to ask you to include your name. That's so we can ensure that everyone has a fair chance to ask questions. Your name will not be passed on to panel members and it will not be read out. Just so that you know, today's webinar is being recorded so that the video can be put on our website for anyone who might be interested but can't make one of the webinar times. Before we go into the report, I'll give a quick introduction to the review. The Minister of Justice established the panel to independently review our electoral laws. The review has a really wide scope that includes many aspects of how elections work. We'll touch on some, but not all of them today. A few topics like online voting and local body elections are out of scope. We were guided by principles about what a good electoral system should be. Things like fairness, encouraging participation, rules that are clear, consistent and practical, and ensuring an effective parliament and government, ensuring a representative parliament, and upholding Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. Last year, we talked to New Zealanders about what they thought was working well within our electoral system and what they thought could be improved. We heard from a diverse range of New Zealanders in over 50 meetings and over 1,700 submissions. We really value the input we received, which you'll see reflected in our interim report and our summary of submissions. Since then, we've been processing what we've heard and deciding what we think needs to change. We combined the input we received with reports from experts modelling on different options and consideration of what's working well in other countries. We want an electoral system that is fair, clear and accessible now and into the future. We're consulting on our draft recommendations now so we can test our thinking and refine our recommendations before we deliver our final report to the Minister in late November this year. Today is an opportunity to ask us any questions you have about the interim report and our recommendations. Our hope is that this will support you to make a submission on the report. To share your views, you can make a written submission or complete a simple survey on our website. Submissions close on the 17th of July. These recommendations are still draft, so we really encourage you to tell us what you think. What you say will help ensure our final report is strong and informed by what New Zealanders think. Today, we'll explain the 6 key areas of change that we think are needed to strengthen our electoral system. As we've developed our recommendations, a few questions have come up over and over again. How can we make the electoral system fairer? How can we make sure that as many people as possible participate? How can we make sure our parliaments and government are as effective and as representative as possible? Taken together, we think these changes will help bring our electoral laws into the 21st century and support a thriving democracy. We don't have enough time today to cover all of the recommendations from the interim report, so we would encourage you to check out the full document or our executive summary if you're interested in learning more. You're welcome to raise other recommendations in our Q&A, however. I will now hand over to Andrew to walk us through the first of the themes. Andrew.
Kia ora. Just getting myself off mute and able to talk to you all. Thank you, Deb. The first of our key changes is making our electoral law fit for the future. The basic framework of the Electoral Act hasn't changed in 60 years. Some parts of it actually date back from the 19th century. Over time, it's become clunky, outdated, and confusing. Our view is that the Electoral Act should be redrafted to make it modern, accessible, and comprehensive. This redraft would be an opportunity to modernise the language and structure of the Electoral Act and to make sure that the rules are clear and consistent. We want to ensure that the law reflects Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and to check whether all the offences and penalties in the Act still make sense. We should say that we found many aspects of electoral law are working well, and these could be kept in a refreshed Act. We also looked at the entrenched provisions. These rules, which include things like the length of the parliamentary term and the voting age, can only be changed by 75% majority vote in Parliament or a referendum. This extra protection reflects the idea that changes to core aspects of the electoral law should typically be made with broad political and public support. We found some gaps and inconsistencies in what's currently protected this way. We've recommended several other provisions should be entrenched, including the rights to vote and to stand as a candidate, the Māori electorates, and the method for allocating seats in Parliament. I'll now hand over to Maria to walk us through the second key theme.
Thank you, Andrew. So our next key theme is upholding Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. Te Tiriti promised that Māori would gain the same rights as non-Māori. However, we found electoral laws, past and present, have made it more difficult for Māori to vote or be represented in Parliament relative to other New Zealanders. As just one example, for over 125 years, the number of Māori electorates was fixed at 4, but over the same period, the number of general electorates was able to increase in line with population growth. This meant the vote of a Māori voter in a Māori electorate was worth less than those in the general electorates. We found that these kinds of differences in treatment between Māori and non-Māori have a legacy today in consistently lower Māori voter participation rates. The Crown has an obligation under Te Tiriti to do better by redressing past breaches, actively protecting Māori rights, and providing equitable opportunities for Māori participation. Te Tiriti should inform all aspects of our electoral system so that Māori rights and interests are always considered. That's why we think the law itself needs to better reflect Te Tiriti. We recommend introducing a requirement in the Electoral Act that anyone fulfilling a function under the Act must give effect to Te Tiriti and its principles. We think this should be an explicit legal obligation and objective for the Electoral Commission. We want to ensure the Electoral Commission has the mandate to continue to improve its services for Māori voters and remove barriers to participation. It should be directly engaging with Māori as iwi, hapu, and individuals on how to best do this. In our interim report, we've also recommended a change to the Electoral Commission's board requirements to ensure it has the knowledge and expertise to deliver on this objective. There are also some other changes we'll talk about shortly that we think would help give effect to Tiriti, such as community funding. I'll now hand over to Robert to walk us through our third key theme.
Thank you, Maria. Next, we're going to talk about MMP. When MMP was introduced, it aimed to balance two objectives. First, to make representation in Parliament better reflect the votes cast by New Zealanders, and second, to ensure governments and parliaments can still operate effectively. We think our MMP rules can be made fairer without losing that balance. Currently, political parties must win at least 5% of the nationwide party vote or one electorate seat to get into Parliament. We think the party vote threshold is higher than it needs to be to achieve this balance. We recommend lowering it to 3.5%. This would make it easier for smaller parties to enter Parliament and make Parliament more representative. Too many small parties could make it hard to form a stable government. However, we think a 3.5% threshold is high enough to prevent too many small parties making it into Parliament. For example, a political party would have needed to have won around 100,000 votes in the 2020 election to meet a 3.5% threshold. At the moment, a political party that wins an electorate seat will receive additional seats in our Parliament based on their party vote, even when they don't reach the 5% party vote threshold. We heard from people that this rule is unfair, and we agree. It gives voters in some electorates more say than voters in other electorates about which parties get represented in Parliament. We think this rule should go, but only if the party vote threshold is lowered so small parties have an easier avenue to get into Parliament. Parliament is made up of a combination of electorate seats and list seats. As our population grows, so do the number of electorate seats. But because the size of Parliament is fixed, this means the number of list seats will decline over time. List seats are important. There need to be enough list seats to ensure parties can be allocated their full share of seats in Parliament. And list seats have also contributed to the growing diversity of Parliament. We therefore recommend the ratio of electorate seats to list seats be fixed at 60 to 40, as it is currently, to safeguard list seats into the future. And the size of Parliament should be allowed to slowly grow over time in line with population to allow this to happen. I will now hand over to Deborah to walk us through our fourth theme.
Thanks, Robert. And before I talk about the theme, we are getting questions coming in, so thank you for that. We'll come to those at the end, and please do continue to send us questions. Moving on to the term of Parliament. Currently, New Zealand holds an election every 3 years. We heard strong arguments for keeping the parliamentary term at 3 years and extending it to 4 years. Under a 4-year term, there may be more time to produce better laws. This may mean that government, Parliament, and MPs can be more effective. On the other hand, it means voters have less frequent opportunities to hold the government to account through elections. Some people also noted that without the other checks on power that we see overseas, frequent elections may be more important. The term of Parliament is entrenched. We think the question of how long the parliamentary term is should be decided by the public in a referendum, not by MPs. 2 previous referendums on the term of Parliament in 1967 and 1990 both saw a strong majority of voters in favour of keeping a 3-year term. But a lot has changed since then, including the introduction of MMP. Our submitters were fairly closely split on this issue. That, combined with the strength of the arguments we heard, makes us think that the time is right to ask the public again what they think about the term of Parliament. A well-resourced information campaign alongside the referendum will help people to make an informed choice. And I'm handing over to Alice to walk us through our 5th key theme. Alice.
Thank you, Deb. A key objective for us in this review is encouraging participation. Voting is a fundamental right for citizens and an important way that people participate in our democracy. We looked at the rules for who can vote, and we think some of them need to change. Our starting point is that the right to vote is an inherent right that should only be restricted when there is a very good reason to do so. The voting age is currently 18, but we think it should be 16. Based on the evidence we've seen, we think 16-year-olds are just as capable of exercising the right to vote as 18-year-olds. We're also encouraged by the evidence and research we've seen from other countries that have lowered the voting age. While these countries have different contexts than New Zealand, there are some indications that allowing 16-year-olds to vote, when many of them are still at home or in school, can contribute to better participation rates among young people. We also looked at the rights of voting in prison. Under the current law, prisoners can't vote if they are serving a sentence of 3 years or more. We think that all prisoners should be able to vote, no matter what their sentence is. In our view, losing this fundamental right shouldn't be used as an additional punishment. Also, because of systemic bias in the justice system, this rule disproportionately impacts Māori, which is inconsistent with Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We also looked at the voting rights of New Zealanders living overseas. We recommend that they should be able to stay out of the country longer without losing their right to vote. It's now much easier for New Zealanders to stay connected to home from abroad, and the law should reflect that. We propose extending the time from 3 years to 2 electoral cycles, which would either be 6 or 8 years, depending on how long the term of Parliament is. We also heard about the importance of education and engagement to encourage participation. Many people thought that these initiatives were best led by communities who knew how to reach their members in ways that are relevant to them, rather than government officials. We see a lot of opportunity in this space and think there should be funding to support community-led initiatives focused on education and participation. We also think there should be specific funding for initiatives delivered by Māori for Māori. Finally, we've looked at the voting process itself. We've recommended some changes to make sure that voting is easy, accessible, and in line with what voters expect. For example, making it a requirement in law to provide advance voting for at least 12 days, and developing standards for polling places to make sure they are widely available and accessible. I will now hand over to Andrew to walk us through our 6th and final key theme.
Thank you, Alice. One of the biggest areas that we think needs fundamental change is financing and campaigning rules. These rules determine where political parties get their funding from, how they can spend it during a campaign, and what information they have to disclose. It's important that these rules support a fair contest of ideas and give people the opportunity to hear a range of views when considering who to vote for. What we found, however, is that in many places the rules are unfair and outdated. Many people have expressed concerns that our political finance rules mean that some people may get more access to political parties based on how much money they have. It can be hard to know who is giving that money and what kind of influence, if any, they may be getting in return. To make the rules more transparent and equitable, we're recommending several changes. Here are some of the bigger ones. Only people who are registered to vote should be able to donate to political parties or candidates, not companies, unions, or other groups. People should not be able to donate more than $30,000 per electoral cycle to each political party and its candidates. Donations where the recipient does not know who the donor is, anonymous donations, over $500 should not be allowed. For any donation over $1,000, the name of the donor should be publicly disclosed in parties' and candidates' annual returns. Now, these changes may impact some parties more than others and could result in them not having the amount of money they need to run their campaigns. We think it's important that political parties are adequately funded because of the key role they play in our electoral system and democracy, particularly under MMP. Political parties already get some state funding through the broadcasting allocation, which provides them with money to advertise on TV, radio, and the internet during election campaigns. We think the broadcasting allocation should be abolished, and the funding that is currently provided for it should be repurposed and modestly increased. Instead of the broadcasting allocation, we're proposing giving registered parties some funding based on the number of votes they received in the most recent election, as well as some base funding of $10,000 per year per party to meet their compliance and reporting costs. We also recommend giving people who make political donations a small tax credit for their donations, similar to how donations to charities are treated at present. Establishing a fund to help parties and candidates engage with Māori. And finally, expanding funding to provide election materials and information in accessible formats for disabled communities. We think that this proposed mix of private and state funding will reduce the risks of large donors having undue influence, while encouraging parties to engage with more voters and seek larger numbers of small donations. On the campaigning side, we found that many of the current rules are outdated. There are separate rules and funding for radio and TV advertising that no longer reflect how modern campaigns are run. As I mentioned already, we think it's time to ditch the current broadcasting rules and create a more level playing field across different media platforms. We also think having different campaigning and advertising rules on election day no longer makes sense, given the rise of advance voting. So we're proposing one set of rules that would apply across the entire voting period. This will be fairer and ensure that people have a more consistent voting experience. I'm now going to hand back to Deborah.
Thanks, Andrew. Like I said at the beginning, we can't go over every single recommendation in the interim report today, but there are a lot of other issues that we think are really important for creating a fair, clearer, and accessible electoral system. You'll see a few examples listed on the slide. If you've had time to look over the interim report, we're happy for you to ask questions about any of the recommendations, and we'll provide a little context before answering if it hasn't been discussed yet. And with that, we're going to open up for questions. As a reminder, please submit your questions through the chat box and we'll answer them as they come in. If we don't have time for all of them today, then please feel free to follow up with our Secretariat by email with any questions. We're going to put our contact details up at the end. Let me start with the first question, which is for you, Andrew. I think you could tackle this one. Would you consider including citizens' assemblies as a participatory democracy tool to tackle the gnarly questions and provide a people-driven consensus in your final recommendations? What do you think, Andrew?
Citizens' assemblies are very interesting. They're a very interesting idea. So the basic concept for those who may not be familiar is that issues on which there's disagreement, which are particularly complex, rather than putting them out just to say a straight referendum and asking the entire public to decide on the matter without the necessary understanding or information to make a sort of a reasoned decision, you bring together a smaller group of ordinary New Zealanders, randomly selected, give them information on the issue and time to debate it and discuss it, and then ask them to try to come to some sort of agreement or some sort of conclusion on the issue, having seen all the matters. One of the problems, I guess, for us as a panel would be trying to work out when such assemblies would be desirable, what sorts of issues that they should be used for, and also what sort of weight should be given to their outcomes. Because in some ways, citizens' assemblies replicate what Parliament already does. Parliament already comes together and debates issues, looks at the information and comes to a result. So how would citizens' assemblies and parliament fit together as decision-making methods? So I'm not sure that our panel has really the place for engaging with that sort of decision-making way of doing things. It's probably a bigger question for our constitution generally as to what sorts of alternative decision-making processes should be brought in alongside Parliament. Our task really is to look at Parliament and how it gets elected, how it gets chosen as a decision-making body of the people, and what it, how it gets created. Whether there should be other alternatives alongside Parliament, I'm afraid it just sort of falls a little bit outside what we can do. We've already got quite a lot to look at, and I think adding that on top would just be one step too far.
Thanks, Andrew. Maria, the next couple of questions probably you could answer. What are the barriers to Māori participation? And there's another question. Are there other examples in the world that Aotearoa can learn from in terms of entrenching Indigenous treaties and having a plural constitution? So the first one, the barriers to Māori participation. And I can repeat the second one if you like.
Thanks, Deb. In terms of the barriers, I think we can see there are different levels in our system. As I mentioned earlier, there are some things that have had a legacy from a long time ago, but there are also present laws which have restrictions on how Māori can vote that I think we've heard have put people off a little bit. Some of those would be around the Māori electoral option, and we know that until very recently Māori weren't able to change electoral roll except every 5 years, and that kind of restriction meant that some people were on an electoral roll they didn't really want to be on. But so that's at a kind of structural level, but at another level we also heard from people that within polling booths they were put off sometimes if their names are mispronounced and some of the things that go on there. So we've got, I think, a range of activities that might dent people's confidence in the system. But I think our recommendations go some way to try and alleviate those, such as recommending that Māori be able to change electoral roll at any time, including up until and on election day. So that's the first part. In terms of international examples, I guess, our terms of reference were for looking at the Electoral Act as it is now, rather than broader constitutional change. And I think a lot of the examples from overseas involve entrenched aspects of a constitution, usually a written constitution. So those are quite different regimes from the system that we have here.
Thanks, Maria. Andrew, I think over to you on political financing. Regarding donations, are the thresholds per individual payment or in total? For example, would 2 donations by the same person of $300 each still be allowed to stay anonymous? Or would the total of $600 mean they have to be disclosed?
So I think we just need to be a little careful of terminology here, because when we're talking about anonymous donations, we're talking about donations where nobody in the party knows who's given the money. So it could be an envelope shows up in the mail with 3 $100 notes in it. That would be anonymous, and we're saying parties should be able to retain individual anonymous donations of up to $500 to allow for still very small gifts where the person just genuinely doesn't want the party to know who they are, maybe because they don't want the party then chasing them up for further donations down the track, or for whatever reason. Any individual donation of more than $500, the party would have to know where they came from, would have to know the donor's identity. And then when that donor gives more than $1,000 in a year, then the Electoral Commission would be told the identity of the donor, who would then make that public. So under $500, if the party or a candidate genuinely does not know where the money's come from, then it can be kept. Between $500 and $1,000, the party or candidate must know the identity of who was given the money, but they don't have to tell the Electoral Commission about it. They just retain that information. As soon as a donor gives more than $1,000 in a year, whether in one gift or multiple gifts, then the Electoral Commission gets told about it and tells the world about it. So that's the framework we're proposing. If people think we've got those thresholds wrong, if people think those thresholds should be placed at other places, we'd like to hear that. That's the sort of information we're really seeking from the public now.
Thanks, Andrew. Robert, a question regarding thresholds. 5% seems to be working fine. Why does it need to change?
Well, as I set out in the description of our recommendation under the theme section, our system of MPs seeks to strike a balance between a representation in Parliament and a representative Parliament and effective parliaments and governments and stable governments. And our view was that 5%, the 5% threshold is higher than it needs to be to achieve that balance, and that we can afford to lower the threshold to 3.5% without putting into jeopardy effective parliaments and stable governments.
Thanks, Robert. Kia ora, thank you all for your mahi. Once the final report has been released, what do next steps look like? How do these suggestions get implemented? Maybe I can answer that. We're way off our final report. What we're hoping is to hear from New Zealanders right now as to what they think of our interim recommendations, so that we can test out what our thinking is. So please do submit. Once the submission process is closed on the 17th of July, we're then going to look at all the feedback that we've received, and of course, again, look at what researchers tell us, modelling and overseas information as well. And we're going to finalise our report. It has to be with the Minister of Justice after the current election by the end of November. It will then be, of course, with the new government to determine the next steps, and it will be out of our hands. So it will be handed over to the government, hopefully, from our point of view, to implement the recommendations. One probably for Alice. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the. Why do you think that prisoners should be able to vote? And there's another one too, Alice. If 16-year-olds get the right to vote, do you think they've got enough information and education to exercise the right?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for those questions. So I guess starting with the prisoners one, we as a panel decided that our starting point when it comes to the right to vote is that it's inherent, it's in the Bill of Rights, and that it is a fundamental right of citizens, but also in New Zealand, permanent residents. And so we think that there needs to be really high justification for taking away that right. And we had a discussion, and we believe that punishment and imprisonment has a different end goal and different intention than voting, which is fundamentally about democratic participation and representation. And we also discussed the fact that the current rule, which is that prisoners can vote unless they've got a sentence longer than 3 years, that can operate unfairly, and that different prisoners can get different sentences for effectively the same offence. So we feel that it is fairer and it sets a better standard for our democracy for all prisoners to vote. And in terms of the question about the voting age, I think that's a really fair question. And it's something that doesn't just apply to 16-year-olds or anyone else, really. Having looked at the evidence and what we heard in consultation, we are satisfied that 16-year-olds have just as much capacity or capability and knowledge as their 18-year-old plus peers to vote. Of course, there will always be instances in which certain people or certain population groups may not have as much access to information. And that's why we really believe that civics education, while the voting age doesn't need to be dependent on a civics education, we do think that that is also a really important part to play. And so we think, as we've recommended, that there should be a bigger focus on community-driven and community-led civics education, not just for 16-year-olds or school-age people, but also for the wider population. So we hope that that will hopefully bring a bit more information to those who might not have it, but ultimately we decided that the potential group of 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds who don't have enough information, the benefits of those who do and who will be able to vote with this new recommendation kind of outweigh those risks.
Thank you. Maria, one of the primary aims of the Maori seats was to increase the level of Maori representation in Parliament, which has largely been achieved, and Maori have high list placings in many parties. Why is entrenchment of the Maori seats required?
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons is because this is an area that we saw there were different rules for the general electorate seats and the Māori electorate seats. And so we thought that that was an inconsistency that should be corrected. So that's the entrenchment part. I guess we also need to think carefully about the differences between Māori representation and people with Māori whakapapa in Parliament. You know, we have 7 Māori electorates that the representatives there are representing Māori constituents. So that's a slightly different aspect of it, I guess. But I think that part of our system is what makes us unique as Aotearoa New Zealand, and we know Te Tiriti has a key role to play in our arrangements. So I think part of the entrenching the Māori seats is all about that, correcting an inconsistency and, giving a nod in some ways to our unique arrangements.
Thank you. Back to the age of voting. Why only lower the voting age to 16? What about younger, such as 12? The population is ageing and it is harder than ever for young people to be heard and have their futures considered. What do you think, Alice?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, at the end of the day, it is going to be somewhat arbitrary setting that age, but 16 has been the, obviously, point of discussion, not only in New Zealand, but in countries we kind of can relate to and see ourselves reflected in. But also, human rights law in New Zealand does affirm the right of people aged 16 to be free from age discrimination. So that was why we picked 16. And I think that point of young people needing to be heard about their futures really rings true. And I think that's also why we suggested 16. But yeah, that's basically 16 was the age and has been in the public conscience and in our law. So that's the age we ended up settling at.
And there's another question that you may feel that you've already answered it, but can you please elaborate on the reasons behind the minimum voting age of 16, 18 and 21 also seem arbitrary? Can there be other criteria for eligibility to vote?
Yeah, so as I said, in some ways it is arbitrary and it has been 18 and 21. Well, it's been 20 in the past and we have had different ages and at some point it does become arbitrary. I think in terms of other criteria for eligibility, it was something we discussed as a panel, but New Zealand's never had any sort of capacity test, which we think is actually a really great strength for our democracy. So again, our starting point was really that the right to vote is fundamental and one of the most important, and so to limit that requires great justification, and we think 16 to 17-year-olds should have that right.
Back to donations, anonymous donations of $500. What stops people from submitting many of these amounts? Should it be split between all parties if people are offering anonymously? What do you think, Andrew?
So first question, what's to stop someone giving multiple amounts of under $500 to a party? Well, the short answer would be nothing, except for the fact that for a donation to be anonymous, no one in the party can know where it came from. So if someone wanted to give the party a very large amount of money through splitting it up into sub $500 amounts and then passing it on to the party with no one in the party having any idea where it's coming from, I suppose our question will be, well, where's the harm in that? What's the problem with that needs some sort of solution? Because the issue with donations, of course, is the fear of quid pro quo, giving the donation, getting something back. If no one in the party knows who's giving the money, there can't be anything given back. Equally, we think it's important that there is the capacity for individuals to give relatively small amounts of money, we've said $500, without having to tell the party, hey, this is who I am, so that you, the party, can then come and chase me for more money. Or simply you just want to give the money over without anyone finding out because, charity and done in, quiet is better and so on. So we think there should still be that capacity to give without having to tell the party who you are. It allows for things like buckets to be passed around at party meetings. It allows for things like sausage sizzles. Whereas if you say there can be no anonymous donations, then what you're saying is if a party holds a sausage sizzle and charges people $5 for a sausage that only costs them $2, the person who buys the sausage has to disclose their identity for the $3 donation. And so there has to be some capacity to give some amount of money without disclosing who you are. Is $500 the right amount? Well, it's what we've thought. Now, if people think it should be lower, we'd love to hear that. But just once again, the argument that there should be no anonymous donations to political parties or candidates ever does run into the problem of, well, what do you do about the person who just wants to give $10 into the party bucket or wants to buy a sausage without telling the party who they are? How do you balance those two things? And that's what we'd be interested to hear about from the public.
Thank you. The MMP threshold fuels the wasted vote argument to discourage voters from supporting smaller parties. Would you support multiple ranked STV-like party votes so that votes for eliminated parties are transferred rather than lost? Robert.
Thanks, Deb. That is one of the questions which the panel considered, and we looked at how that might help voters to express their preferences with more precision and more nuance. But we also thought about the impact that would have on the overall, the complexity of the voting process. And where we came down was that the advantages that might accrue to voters who do want to be able to make a vote for a party that may not reach the threshold, and then also so that the voters don't waste it, enable that vote to be able to transfer to a vote that's more to a party that's more likely to get over the threshold. We thought providing for that the benefits of that to those voters would be outweighed by the complexity and the potential confusion that it would introduce into the overall voting system. And so we felt that it would be better for supporters of small parties to recommend lowering the party vote threshold from 5% to 3.5%, but not introducing any additional complexity into the overall voting system.
Thank you. Andrew, maybe I can throw this one to you. Was there consideration around 51% threshold for referendums? 51% seems low where there is a chance of 49% losing on the referendum. 49% is a big chunk. Would 75% be a better threshold?
To be honest, that's not something we considered. We didn't actually consider referendums directly because, once again, our focus is on electing people to Parliament. I mean, we're looking at the aspects of the electoral system that relate to parliamentary elections, not other decision-making processes that our constitution may have. I guess the one thing I'd say about having a heightened threshold for referendum is If you say you have a 75% threshold for something to pass a referendum, then essentially you're giving a very, very large weight to the status quo. Because you're saying if you want to change something, then you have to get 3/4 of New Zealanders to agree to change it. And that seems a little unfair. Why should a majority not be able to get the laws they want to live under just because 26% of New Zealanders want to keep what is? So supermajorities come at the cost of entrenching the status quo. And you have to ask, why do you want to entrench the status quo? Why do you want to make it harder to change things? So that would be as much as I'd personally say, but I just emphasize we, the panel, didn't discuss referendums, we didn't discuss thresholds, so it just sort of fell outside of our ambit of issues to look at.
Thank you. And maybe you can just hold the mic right there. Why are you recommending a donations cap of 30,000? That seems very high to me.
So it's 30,000 across an electoral cycle, just to note. So that would be over 3 years. If someone wants to give 30,000 in 1 year and nothing in the other 2 years, or they want to give 10,000 across the 3 years, and so on and so on. Why did we set it at what seems like a very high level? Again, this is something we would love to hear from the public on. If it's too high, if people should be at a lower cap, we'd love to hear if people think that. Contrary-wise, if 30,000 is too restrictive and people think that people should be free to spend their money as they wish, we'd like to hear that too. 30,000 seemed to us to be an amount that allowed people to still use their wealth as they chose in the political arena, which is something that's important. It carries with it rights of freedom of expression. It carries with it the right to support those that you have, ideologically believe in, and so on. And those are important values. Also, New Zealand's never had caps on donations outside of overseas donations. So it's the first time we'd be saying that New Zealanders are limited in how much they can use their wealth to support political causes they believe in. And because it is a new thing we're seeking to introduce, that we're arguing for, we thought we should start at a relatively high level, rather than come in really, really hard at a very low level. So it is a new innovation. It still allows for relatively high amounts of giving from individuals, but again, it's across a whole parliamentary term, and we seek feedback now on whether we've got it right. Thank you.
We've got 2 more questions, and then we will close off for this webinar, unless there are any other burning questions that we've got time for. But this one is for you, Alice. This might not be in the terms of reference. Did the panel consider compulsory voting to improve participation?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we did consider compulsory voting. So obviously some comparative countries have compulsory voting, or more accurately, compulsory showing up to the poll and filling in a ballot, whatever that looks like. But we ended up deciding that that step wasn't necessary yet for New Zealand. New Zealand has fairly good voting turnout rates and a democratic culture that we don't think that compulsory voting is necessary at the moment. And we also think that the choice not to vote is actually a valid choice for some, and we think it could be an overstep on the state to make that compulsory. So yes, we did consider it, but decided it didn't really fit with our current democratic culture.
Thanks. And the last question, why are you recommending a referendum? Couldn't Parliament vote to change the term? This is the referendum on the 4-year term that we're recommending. Yes, Parliament could, by 75% vote, extend its own term. We think that the term of Parliament really needs to be decided by referendum. It seems to us that really parliamentarians deciding to extend their own term is in some ways perverse. It would be like someone employed on a contract unilaterally extending their own contract. We think this is something that does need to go to referendum alongside a really robust information campaign so that New Zealanders understand all of the issues and can make a decision for themselves. And that's all the questions that that you've had in this session, and I thank you for joining us and for your questions. We really do appreciate your interest in the review. These issues are central to our democracy, and it's important we hear from a range of people. Again, we encourage you to make a written submission. There is a survey that you can fill out on the site as well. So that we can consider what you think before we prepare our final report for the Minister. The deadline is the 17th of July, and more details are available on our website. We'll leave the link up in the next slide, and please do get in touch if you have any questions. Maria, please, can you close out today's session with a karakia? Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa mō tēnei whakawhiti kōrero me karakia tātou. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, haumi e hui e tae ki e.
Thank you.